Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA. AASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. That's AASA. AASA is a fantastic organisation. I'm a member, and in fact my guest this week is also a member, and more than a member, she's on the committee. AASA does a lot of work to support animal studies scholars. One of the key things it does is it organises a conference every 2 years. The next conference is coming up in the middle of 2019. It's going to be held in New Zealand, and you should really start thinking about your abstract for that conference. So the call for papers is open now. You need to start thinking about submitting your abstract and also how you're going to fund your trip out to New Zealand. New Zealand is fantastic. I recommend you take a jacket, but it's going to be a little bit expensive to get there. So start having a think about that and support AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now we actually have a new sponsor as well for this episode, a brand new sponsor who's come on board this week, and this sponsor is MC Pony. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, who's MC Pony? Never heard of MC Pony. Well, you're wrong. You actually do know MC Pony because the intro music to this podcast, you know, that kind of very catchy but a little bit irritating, Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan, that's MC Pony. So that intro music was done by my friend Elizabeth Usher, who's MC Pony, and she wants you to know that she has got a big body of work that you should get enthused about. So her website is Veganthused. It's veganthused.com, and you'll be able to find it in the notes. And MC Pony has a lot of music there. A lot of it has to do with animal issues. And did you know that at the moment she's actually in the Triple J Unearthed charts? Her song Double Decade Vegan is charting very nicely, thank you. So check out MC Pony's work, get vegan enthused, and also if you're running a concert or a festival and you need a performer, MC Pony is always there to help. Okay, let's get down to business, people. This week, I'm coming to you from the city of Melbourne, one of my favourite cities in the world, but I can tell you it's very, very cold and very windy. But we're inside, which makes life a little bit easier. Now, I'm very lucky to be joined by Lynn Mowson. I just practiced her name before. Did I get that right? Yeah, I'm getting a nod. Now, I've known Lynn for quite a few years from my time when I was based at the University of Melbourne. Lynn has a PhD in fine arts, so Lynn is both an artist and a scholar. And Lynn has quite a few roles around the university and quite a few roles to do with animal studies. She helps manage the University of Melbourne's Human Rights and Animal Ethics Research Network, HRAE. She also runs the monthly Knowing Animals reading group, and she is the Vice Chair of AASA, the wonderful AASA who we were talking about just a moment ago. So today we're going to discuss Lynn's new book chapter that's coming out in a brand new book, a really exciting book. The chapter is titled Making and Unmaking Mammalian Bodies, Sculptural Practices as Traumatic Testimony. And the chapter is going to appear in the upcoming and I don't know if I'm getting that one right. Animaladies book, which is co-edited by the wonderful Lorri Gruen and the equally wonderful Fiona Probyn-Rapsey. So welcome to the podcast, Lynn.
Thank you, Siobhan.
Okay, Lynn, we've heard a lot from me. Now we want to hear from you. What inspired this book chapter?
Well, it's quite a long story, but the chapter was written for Animaladies, the book, which came out of the Most Fabulous conference in 2016, which also had an exhibition attached to it, curated by Maddie Boyd, Melissa Boyd and Yvette Watts, powerhouses of art in Australia to do with animals. And I initially entered to go into that exhibition. and create a body of work specifically for that exhibition. And then I thought, well, should come along and put a paper in too. And when I looked at the call for papers, I was astonished. It was like it was made for me. It's Animaladies is a combination of animal, maladies, and ladies. And I had written a fairly feminist-driven PhD, which dealt with the issue of dealing with the trauma of being an animal advocate and trying to find new material languages to express some of the problems going on in our treatment to animals. And it was just a very, very stunning and original conference. And so when the call for book chapters came out, I obviously selected to put something in, and I'm very lucky. My work, Boob Escapes, is on the cover of the book, which is something I'm thrilled about. Thank you, Lorri and Fiona, for your support of my work. So the chapter actually goes through, tries to go through some of the key elements of my PhD. And as you know, PhDs are sprawling works that often try to cover too much. But also it covers, I'm a visual artist, I'm a sculptor. And during the course of my PhD, which was originally on empathy and human sculpture, there came a point where I was no longer able to just deal with the human. My figures started having teats pop out on them. I started butchering portraits of animals. There was just this strange kind of incursion of the animal. I didn't want the animal in my practice. I'd been vegan for many years by that time. I'd grown up with animal activism as part of my family life. My sister was a member of the ALF when I was a child. And I had tried to somehow keep this part of my practice very separate, mostly because I didn't know quite how to deal with it. And I was getting quite close to the end of my PhD when my supervisor just sat down and said, "You can't ignore this anymore. You can't ignore the animal in your work. Something is going on here, and you're talking all about empathy and humans and sculpture, and you really need to be talking about the animal." And that is the point when my PhD, very late in the day, kind of screeched to a halt, turned around and faced this ginormous world of animal studies, which I hadn't realised existed. And I had a rapid point of catching up. But that allowed me to really kind of understand what was going on. My work was had been very influenced by the death of pregnant cattle that I'd seen. During the course of my PhD, like many people, I had a baby. And I kind of faced a lot of hostility to the idea I'd bring up a vegan child. People were accusing me of brainwashing or being kind of not giving my child a choice. And I didn't have the language to talk about how carnism is a choice. So I started researching into the dairy industry and things like that. And I was witnessing a lot of videos. I felt like I really needed to catch up. I'd ignored my animal advocacy for a few years. And in catching up, I watched this horrific footage of pregnant cows being slaughtered. And that influenced the body of works that I was working on. They went from being about people into being about flayed skins and flayed baby skins, because what I found out is that bodies of those little fetal calves that I watched being slaughtered were incredibly valued products called slink leather, which is a very fine leather. It's used for vellums, scrolls, gloves, luxury car. It's much more highly desirable than lamb slink because it's larger in size. So there's this whole trade that goes on around this accidental death, and that fed into my body of works where I started using latex and creating latex to create a kind of membrane-like skin, and depicted this, still using the human-animal form to depict this series of works. And that extended, the Slink series extended to also incorporate these sack-like forms, and that was in response to Timothy Patriarch's book. Have I said that name right?
I think so.
every 12 seconds, in which, while I was reading that, there came across this description of how these grey oblong sacs will appear into the slink room, slink being the name in abattoirs for the fetal calf, and how they hung this little body up on hooks through the mouth and through the anus and drained the blood from it. And this is how I came across the fact that these little bodies are being kept in this strange liminal space where they're supposed to not... they're supposed to be prevented from breathing so they don't feel pain, but yet we draw blood. They need them alive in order for the heart to pump, for the blood to come out, for this fetal bovine blood, which becomes fetal bovine serum. So the series Slink sort of dealt with that, but it dealt with it sort of indirectly because it dealt with it very traumatically. So my paper in Animaladies tries to work out, it's very easy for me now to talk back very sensibly about the progress of those works. But at the time, they were fighting. I was suppressing them coming through my work, and I was suppressing the information. This was before my tutor had said, my lecturer had said, you must change your topic. And I was really trying to sort of avoid the animal in my work, mostly because the reaction I got academically was that I was just being a mad vegan nutter, and I was bringing my politics to the table, and this was not, the stuff of academia, and there was no one out there, everyone had read Derrida, but, Derrida kept eating meat, or, so no one felt that there was a space for the vegan attitude in academia. So the chapter was dealing with the way these things weren't coming out very clearly and the way trauma helped me create a new language, because the trauma that I was feeling about reading and seeing this information came out in the way I developed the material language, so the sculptural language in which I expressed it. So the same time as I was doing that Slink series, I did a series called Flesh Lumps, which was where I was completely breaking up and smashing and reducing to flesh these portraits of animals I was doing. So I was doing these portraits, and I call them portraits in the sculptural sense. They were a sort of head and neck of an animal, but they were a strange hybrid animal that was part kind of horse, goat, sheep, cow, meat animals basically. But it was animal without flesh. So it was an animal in a headline at a abattoir. And again, I was kind of, when I read the Timothy Pagerat's work, that was that very sort of distinct description he has about seeing all the heads in a line in the slaughterhouse and how they are this sort of point where you can still recognize the animal, but no longer completely recognize. They're not quite just flesh or not quite just meat. And that was sort of what I was trying to attempt to do in crushing these up. Not only was I acting out the role of kind of butcher, dissembling and squashing and dismantling them, I was leaving little traces of them. I was leaving eyes or nose sockets or something to try and keep the subject in the work. So my work, there was quite a few chapters that were very sculptural history. They were about where does the subject lie in the object. And that became very important to me about creating this idea that you could still see in the animal fleshy lump part of the actual original animal, and that original animal had come from a individual portrait that I'd made. So there was this idea of trying, how do we see past these millions of animals being killed every day, turning into these lumps of flesh? And I think it was at the point not long after I was told to look at the animal, I was very, very fortunate that someone made a joke about the book, The Sexual Politics of Meat. Next you'll be reading The Sexual Politics of Meat, someone said. And I went, what's that? What is that? Is that really a book? And off I went, got the Carol Adams book, and there it was. Carol Adams very clearly talked about the way language took the subject out of the object of meat, how the animal was removed, how they were absented from meat in her classic text on the absent referent. So it all sort of came together during that PhD, and I think this chapter for Animaladies in some ways goes through that, but it goes through it in a kind of in a much clearer way, where I'm now looking back and I'm no longer feeling like the freaky, I do still feel like the vegan killjoy, freaky bunny honey hugger, animal lover, emotional, strange thing. And that's what Animaladies was. It allowed us all to actually kind of bring emotion back into animal studies, because I found it very difficult when I first approached animal studies, and especially, I guess, approaching it through philosophy, the push on the rational, as if we can just all go out and talk to everyone, and if we've got the right rational argument, we will change the world, seemed to me it hadn't completely worked. It provided us with some tools, but perhaps not the tools by which we understand how we become meat eaters, and how we can challenge those ideas and have empathy towards animals. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
It was a long answer, but it was fascinating. So I think we should give a quick shout out to Lorri, Gruen and Fiona Probyn-Rapsey, and mention that the second Animaladies conference is coming up soonish.
In December 13th and 14th, I think. And
is the call for papers still open for that?
No, I don't think it is. I could be wrong. You can go to the website, though. They have a website. It's the University of Wollongong is running it this year. And if you look for Animaladies 2, but I think the call for papers has finished.
Well, it was such a well-received conference. It seems to me to be one of those events that had quite a profound impact on a lot of attendees. I unfortunately wasn't there, but I hope to be at the next one. Even though I won't be speaking, I'm still very enthusiastic about going and hearing the papers, because, as I say, it seems to have had a profound impact on everyone who was part of it. So let's hope the next one is as impactful. So, Lynn, your style of academic engagement is quite different to what I'm used to and what perhaps a lot of listeners are used to. So we're talking about creative works, and then when we're talking about writing, whether it be a book chapter or exegesis, that then critically evaluates or reflects on or builds on those artworks. So can you start by saying something about the process of creating the art that then is the subject of your discussion in the book chapter?
Well, they're quite different. So the work that I put into that I talk about as well in the book chapter is Boob Escapes, which is a later work which I made for Animaladies specifically, and was a series that I'm still finishing off as we speak. So my series of works take quite a long time to make, and they grow and they iterate. And so the other series, Slink and Flesh Lumps, which are in the chapter, as I said, they kind of came about sort of in a quite haphazard way, in a little bit sort of a way where they're a little bit repressed, and I only found out later what they're about. Whereas with Boob Escape, that was an ongoing investigation into the dairy industry. So I'd come across focused on the dairy industry with Slink and the death of pregnant cattle. I wanted to find out why pregnant cattle were going to slaughter at such large numbers. So the way I work is I research furiously, and I don't research in secondary literature. I research in codes of conduct and CSIRO texts, and so basically sort of the primary literature. And I read all of that, and I do usually about 3 or 4 to 6 months of very intense research. And then I let it bubble, and I don't look at it again. And then I start making work. And this doesn't work for me very well, because then I make the work, and then I have to talk about the work, and I have to go back and look at all the work again to write about the work. So it's not the normal way of researching, and I'm in the middle of that at the moment with one of my a new body of works. But it's the way I have to work. I have to take in all the information and let it kind of percolate, I guess, and then go into the studio and start making. So with Boob Escapes, I kind of almost did a forensic investigation into sort of mastitis and codes of conduct around kind of when animals were killed when they were pregnant, lameness, flames, how they treat the udders. And I started focusing down on the udder, this kind of thing that we sort of share as mammals. I'm very interested in mammalian homologies. By focusing on the udder, I started making the udders, and I was making them to look like they had mastitis. So I was making this skin that was rather unattractive, peeling and flaking and bubbling. And as anyone who's seen images of dairy cows with ulcers will know that they're particularly ugly things. And as this series progressed, some of the teats became nipples and some of the udders became breasts, and that kind of interlinked mammalian body, this idea that we all would like to perhaps breastfeed or feed our own or nurture our own. So this is this idea that's very key in my work, which is to look at the things we share with animals. And so we share with mammals, this desire to help our young and nurture our young. And I was looking and reading all the information from the dairy industry, getting the farmer's wife to talk about how the industry was, looking after the calves by taking them away from the bad mothers, and all that goes on in my head when I'm kind of making these works. And Boob Escapes started as a kind of quite a small little installation, Animaladies, with about 8 or 9 pieces, and then I took the work to the Animal Museum in LA for a show called The Sexual Politics of Meat, in honour of Carol Adams's work, and by that stage it had become a suite of about 15 pieces, and more recently it's been shown, and it's kind of probably about 10 metres long. And as the work progresses, more things come into it. So there's parts of the fabric, the latex fabric I make, are very thin and fragmented, and that to me is a material way of showing the presence of those slink baby animals, the fetal animals. There's little supernumerary teats. These are those little extra teats that calves can be born with, and they're just snipped off with scissors without anaesthetic because they get in the way of the milking machines. And so the work really deals with milk and milking, and this idea of what we'll do to other animals to get milk and how we'll exploit them. But it also kind of homages art historical multi-breasted goddess kind of creatures, and also interspecies feeding. There's a lot of kind of humans feeding animals, and animals feed humans. I think I always sort of say, there's no doubting whose needs are met mostly when that's being done, and it's the humans. Very often they're nurturing animals in order to keep them alive within the herd. But there's so Boob Escapes, so that tends to be how I work. I research the animal issues quite specifically, and then I make a body of work, and then I have to stop and turn around and write about it. And it's not the best method. I'm trying to do it differently at the moment. I'm writing about bioactives, which is so I sort of remain quite closely to the mammal body, and bioactives incorporates the fetal bovine serum, but also placental and umbilical material that's collected from fetal calves and ovines, and is used in the new biotechnologies industry, which of course is. And so my interest in that comes from my interest in slink leather, and then kind of getting into being very excited about the biofabrication of leather, and then finding out that the biofabricated leather was being done by a biopsy of donor animals, plus used, at that stage, quite large quantities of fetal bovine serum. And similarly, the in vitro meat industry is based on the fetal bovine serum. And that swings all my work now, becomes very connected here, because the flesh lumps become the kind of meat that's produced. The slink work, which talks about the death of the pregnant cattle and the death of the fetal cattle, comes back in. Boob Escapes, which is about, the animals which go into producing these bioactives. It's through the death of the unproductive cow that we get, pregnant cows being slaughtered and the fetal bovine serum being procured. So my new work tries to bring all of those together in line with the current situation with biofabricated leather and in vitro meat.
And Lynn, do you know why it is that you don't feel that you want to read and then write? So it strikes me that you've kind of got this middle step that someone such as myself doesn't engage with. You create artwork. Do you know why that matters to you, or why you're driven to do that?
Well, I'm an artist. I am a sculptor, but I am actually now very driven to keep working sculpturally in this area, and I work something out while I'm doing it, but also there is something very effective about sculpture. So I know that I've had people stand in front of my works who, especially like something like Boob Escapes, who will clench their breasts when they hold them, men as well as women. You know, they clench their breasts because there's, the skin is painful. Some of them are very swollen. They've reminded people of, things like breast cancer, and that there's an effective output from sculptural work that you get obviously from other forms of creative writing and things like that. But I'm not a creative writer, and I think that's a really useful way of approaching. I think we all approach animal kind of advocacy in our own way, and it's my way of approaching it is through representing it, and I do get very strong responses, and somewhat not always what I want. I've had vegans walk into my exhibition and go, "I can't go in there, I'm a vegan," which is very funny. And I've had of my flesh lump series, I've had carnists say, "Oh, now I want a ham sandwich," which is not the response I wanted. So, but it gets to people in different ways to words. So, and I struggle with the challenge of trying to then kind of draw out, because some of the research I do into things like the fetal bovine serum need also to come out in publications and enter the academic world. So I do need to write about my work. But the writing is more of the challenge than the making for me.
Wonderful. Well, Lynn, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I hope so.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, very clearly. Well, very clearly. As I said, my sister was an animal activist, and at the age of 13, I remember being very bored on a summer holiday, lying around her bed, and I read her very tattered copy of Peter Singer's Animal Liberation.
Classic,
which coincided with the time in which someone had given me a copy of William Blake's poems, and I'd come across William Blake's poem The Fly, which if you hadn't asked for an animal studies scholar, I would have probably said William Blake's poems.
Wonderful. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, probably this Animaladies paper and my PhD. Of course, my PhD. I also wrote a chapter for The Art of the Animal, Women Respond to the Sexual Politics of Meat. So that was the first thing that went into a book by Lantin Books in 2015.
Wonderful. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I'm going to be very naughty. And I'm going to say, I want to pick a piece of animal studies scholar, a paper and a person. So the paper would be Cora Diamond's Eating Meat, Eating People, I think. That was the first bit of animal studies scholarship I read that really made me realise there was a different way of doing animal studies, that we could move away from the rational philosophical argument about rights, and we could talk about connections, and we can talk about the things we share with animals, and we could talk about life and death and birth. So that was incredibly influential. And then Carol Adams would be the one, if I had to pick the one whose work has probably rung truest to me. It's not that I always read it and kind of use it. It's more that she provides language that explains and assists me understanding the sculptural.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, that's depends on your discipline. For all of those doing incredible fieldwork studies and things, that's quite different to the humanities and the creative humanities. I believe very strongly in what AFCO calls conceptual activism. And I think every time we make a piece of work that is creative, we undertake conceptual activism. We try and undermine kind of the way we think about animals and change people's views on it and try and destabilise carnism, I suspect I'm trying to say.
Wonderful. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would pretty much just say stop eating and exploiting and hunting animals. Full stop. They're not ours to eat, to be entertained by, to chase around, or to research on in any form. So I'd like a vegan world.
Modest ambitions there, Lynn. So what are you working on next?
I'm currently working on a paper and a body of work on bioactives. So again, I'm looking at those elements in which that go into these replacement meats and replacement leather. Not to kind of criticise those, but to make us aware that there is still a use of animals going on in this, and there is a very strange accidental industry. The fetal bovine serum industry is amazing. It's such a big industry. It produces such a lucrative product, and yet it relies on a completely accidental source, which is the death of pregnant animals. And if anyone's got any information out there about how those animals are sourced, that would be great. And I'm producing a series of what I call diagrammatic sculptures. So these are sculptures that try and link the elements that go into producing in vitro meat and biofabricated leathers, and try, in the way that art can do so brilliantly, show those very strange silences about where animals are involved.
So where can people find out more about your work?
I have a website, www.Lynn Mowson. I even said my name wrong there. LYNNMOWSON.com.
Wonderful. Well, Lynn, thank you so much for coming on Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Are you following us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or merely on Twitter at SO_S? Have you liked us on Facebook at Knowing Animals? Are you following us on Instagram? Most importantly, have you subscribed and left a review via iTunes? The people at iTunes are very, very powerful. You need to leave a review if Knowing Animals is to be easily found by other people. That's all for me. Thank you for joining us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.